Guten Abend, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jeff Baierlein. I'm the director of the consultancy Viristar. We work with adventure and outdoor programs and experiences worldwide on safety and quality. And I'm happy to talk with you today a little bit about adventure tourism safety regulations and take you on a trip around the world to understand how safety regulations for adventure activities can advance the sector of adventure tourism. I'd like to start here in beautiful New Zealand, and this is, of course, a world-class adventure tourism destination. And a young woman, Emily Jordan, had finished her law studies at her university in the United Kingdom, and she decided in 2008 to take an adventure travel holiday to New Zealand. And she joined up with a riverboarding trip where you float down a whitewater river, and she became entrapped underwater against a rock. She was trapped underwater for 20 minutes, and she lost her life in this incident. And following that, there was significant political pressure on the government of New Zealand to improve the safety of adventure activities in that country, and the government passed adventure safety regulations so that the tragedy that Emily and her family had experienced might not happen again. Now, the tragedy of Emily losing her life on an adventure activity in New Zealand wasn't the only safety incident that had occurred. In 1993, a group of children were out sea kayaking in the south coast of England in Lyme Bay, and they got blown out by some heavy winds, and 4 children drowned. And the government passed the world's first safety law specifically for adventure activities in 1996. Some years later, a child died on a trek in northern India, in the Himalayas, and after about 10 years of back and forth between the government and the adventure sector in Maharashtra, the state of Maharashtra, India, Maharashtra and also Kerala state passed adventure tourism safety regulations. In Switzerland, 18 tourists and 3 guides drowned in a canyoneering flash flood in Saxenbach Gorge in 1999. And after many years of pressure, the government passed a law around adventure safety in that country. And then most recently, about a year and a half ago, in the Eastern European nation of Georgia, 2 paragliders had gone off of a cliff in Gudari in the Caucasus Mountains and had crashed against the base of the cliff. A helicopter with 8 of the country's best medical and rescue experts came in to rescue the paragliders. The tail rotor of the helicopter hit the cliff, and the helicopter crashed, killing everybody on board, and one of the paragliders died. This is the explosion here of the helicopter, killing all 8 rescuers. Following that terribly tragic incident and a national day of mourning, the government in Georgia became involved in developing adventure safety regulations in the nation of Georgia so that might not happen again. There are not many countries in the world that have safety regulations specific to adventure tourism or adventure travel or adventure activities. These laws exist in the United Kingdom, in the United Arab Emirates, in Oman, which is pivoting from an oil and gas-based economy to being heavily involved in adventure tourism and adventure travel, in Finland, in New Zealand, Switzerland, in the territory of Yukon in Canada, and a couple states in India. There are some other nations that are also considering adventure tourism safety regulations to boost the consistency and high quality of adventure tourism operations, and those include the nation of Georgia, Japan, Singapore, and there are some early conversations in South Africa as well. And our consultancy has been involved in a number of these countries with facilitating some of these conversations to advance the quality and the safety of adventure activities through standards and through regulation where it's appropriate. Why regulate adventure activities at the governmental level? Why not let the private industry figure out what are the safety standards and allow the private sector to do this? Well, in our work, we find that many adventure tourism operators want safety regulations. And we were invited to come into the nation of Georgia, and I met with a number of adventure tourism operators there, and they said, we want to be regulated. We want a set of standards that every single operator has to meet, so we know that there won't be some that will cut corners and be cheaper, but have safety problems and drag down the whole industry in our country. We were invited to talk with political representatives in Japan at the national and prefectural level by the adventure tourism sector in Japan, who said, we want regulations. This is going to improve the safety and the quality and the reputation of adventure tourism in Japan. And so we'd like you to come and talk about how this is done elsewhere in the world. When there's a regulatory system that helps ensure a fair playing field for all adventure tourism operators. And it can benefit not just the participants, who are more likely to have good safety outcomes, not just the individual operators, who are likely to have a good reputation, but it can enhance the adventure tourism sector across an entire nation and make that nation or that region a more attractive destination globally for adventure tourism customers. There are, in the theory of conformance regimes, 3 ways to seek conformance to a certain standard. 1, you can have pure self-regulation, where any operator will say, I am going to set safety standards for my own company, and we will meet them. No one's going to check up on me, but I'm interested in quality, so I'm going to figure out what quality and safety looks like, and I will meet those standards. That's not very effective because some people won't understand what safety looks like, or they'll be motivated to cut costs. What's more effective as a conformance regime is to have a third-party body, like an industry association, establish standards, and the Adventure Travel Trade Association has established some standards for safety and quality in adventure travel. And then to have an audit mechanism where people get inspected to evaluate are they meeting those standards, and then they get some sort of a badge, a recognition that they can offer to the public that says, hey, we have met these industry standards. This is better than the absence of some sort of industry standard. However, it's also optional. It's not compulsory. And this happened in Switzerland, for example, after the Sachsenbach Gorge tragedy. A voluntary conformance regime for safety was put in place called Safety and Adventure. But a number of operators didn't follow through because they thought, oh, this is expensive. It's not required. Why bother? And so after years of prodding, the government finally passed a law that said, okay, everybody has to meet this certain standard for adventure safety. And that's the most effective way to have quality and safety in adventure travel, when everyone is required to meet a reasonable standard that is developed by the private sector in collaboration with the government. Why talk about regulation of the adventure sector with respect to safety now? Well, in many destinations, the expectations for safety and quality are increasing. We can't get away with any more as adventure operators what we could in the 1970s and the 1980s. The expectations are higher. And there are an increasing number of certifications and accreditation schemes for adventure guides and adventure operators, the companies themselves. So there's increasing expectation that there's formal training and conformance to standards. And there's increasing recognition that when the adventure travel, adventure tourism industry is performing at a high level, that has benefits for the entire country. In some countries, as we heard a couple of days ago at the opening ceremony in Albania, they really see tourism as an important part of economic growth and economic development and an eventual connection with the European Union. So let's talk now mechanics. What does it look like to have a regulatory structure for adventure safety. And I should say that I'm with a consulting company that works with governments and works with the private sector to develop these, but I'm not a regulator or a government official. There are 5 ways that, or 5 components to developing an effective regulatory scheme, and we'll walk through these one by one. The first one is authorizing law. Before the government can regulate adventure safety, it has to have the legal authority to do that. Now, in most nations, there's a generic occupational safety and health law that allows the government to regulate various industries and various sectors. However, some countries have elected to establish an adventure safety law that specifically says we as the government are going to regulate the adventure sector. And that's the case in New Zealand, in the UK, that's the case in Switzerland, and that's the case in the territory of Yukon in Canada. Underneath the law, which is usually very broad, the law basically says we as a government can regulate adventure activities, and then it's up to the executive branch to create the specific regulations. The regulations vary from country to country, of course, but there are some things that they have in common. They often will talk about the scope of who gets regulated. So it's typically commercial operators, typically schools are exempted, military is exempted, government is exempted, and non-commercial like voluntary meetups and clubs are exempted from the regulations. Usually it's the health and safety agency that's selected as the industry body that regulates it, but it could be a tourism agency or somebody else. And then there's a development of the safety standards, what's actually required in terms of behavior and practices of the adventure tourism operators. There may be some sort of an audit process where the government has people to come in and look and make sure people are actually doing the right things. And then the regulations will say this is a registry or this is a licensure process or whatever kind of permits and permissions the adventure tour operators will get. And there'll be other mechanical pieces like fines for nonconformance and repeal processes and suspension processes and that sort of thing. So we see this in New Zealand, we see these regulations in the state of Kerala, in India, and also in Oman, there's a number of other places as well. And typically you can go online and read them. You may need to do some interpretation and see how they've constructed things. The third level is to look at the particular safety standards that adventure tourism operators must conform to. And New Zealand, I think, has done the world's best job in articulating the safety expectations for adventure tourism operators. And these will vary from place to place, but there are some commonalities and things that are accepted as generally good practice. And often, as part of these standards, a third-party audit is built in. So if somebody is coming in who is qualified to perform audits and who is recognized by the government to inspect a tourism operator and verify that they are meeting those standards, communicate that to the government, and then the government issues the permit or puts them on the registry or completes the licensure process. The standards might include things like you must have a written safety management system or risk management plan in your organization. You have to have a culture of safety exemplified by commitment from the top leadership of the organization to good safety. You have to have written safety objectives. You have to have a sufficient number of competent adventure leaders. You have to have a sufficient quantity of fit-for-purpose equipment. You have to have an incident reporting and analysis process. You have to have a written emergency plan, and perhaps there's a requirement that you have practiced it. You have to have a continuous improvement process, so you're always learning as an adventure tourism operator and always improving. So these are some common things that you'll see in these standards. So that's where the government comes in to create regulatory superstructure, but this only works if there's underlying intellectual architecture that helps adventure tourism operators how to meet these safety standards. And one of the pieces of that that's used in some places, for example, the UK, is what's called an approved code of practice. And a code of practice gives specific detail about what does it look like to have competent staff? What is required when we say a sufficient quantity of fit-for-purpose equipment? And these codes of practice are typically created in collaboration between government and the private sector. But what's different about these is that the government formally approves these. And for example, in the UK, these approved codes of practice bring adventure tourism operators special legal protections, so that if there is a safety incident, but the adventure tourism operator was following the requirements of that approved code of practice, under the law, they cannot be held negligent for that safety incident if they followed that code of practice. And so that's an important tool for the adventure tourism industry, and so something to consider in regions that don't have this. In addition to approved codes of practice, it's helpful for the private sector to develop good practice guides that provide additional detailed guidance. And this is often hyper-specific to a particular activity. If you're doing whitewater rafting, you have these items in your first aid kit, you have these extra supplies, you have this type of PFD, you have this ratio of guides to staff, and lots of other details. So the government is developing laws and regulations and safety standards in collaboration with the private sector, and then the government can support the private sector primarily with money, but also with logistical support, like we will find meeting spaces for you and we will buy coffee and donuts for you as the private sector for years. So you can come up with good practice guides, you can come up with adventure safety standards, you can come up with training schemes and certification or qualification schemes, you can come up with organizational accreditation schemes as the private sector, so that you are building capacity within the private sector to show good safety practices so that you can meet the government regulations. It's really important here, I think, for the government to recognize that the private sector needs time and money, at least, and maybe logistical support from the government in order to effectively build this intellectual architecture so that the industry operators are supported to meet the safety standards in the regulations. So let's see, I think, so that's what I wanted to say about that. Those are the 5 pieces that can be generated to support quality adventure safety regulations, authorizing law and then more specific regulations underneath that. Some places have elected to create an approved code of practice. Singapore just published a few months ago an approved code of practice for outdoor adventure activities. And then it's important for the government to support the private sector with developing good practice guides, adventure safety standards, training schemes for individual operators, and other sorts of support so that the industry has the resources to meet the new safety requirements under the regulations. Australia has been working on adventure safety standards for some years, driven by the difficulty in obtaining insurance for adventure operators in that country. And originally, Australia has states that have a fair amount of power and autonomy. Originally, adventure safety standards on a voluntary basis were developed state by state. This quickly became a problem. It was recognized when adventure tourism operators moved across state lines. And so the government paid the private sector for some years to sit together and come up with one national standard for the whole country. And so if you're in a larger country with states or provinces, it's generally better to have one unitary system for the whole country so that adventure tourism operators that are moving from place to place don't have a patchwork of regulations. when we came into the nation of Georgia to draft adventure tourism safety regulations for high-risk adventure activities there, one of the things that I talked about with my team there was how much time should we give different adventure tourism operators in the country, mountaineering, rafting, zip line, and so on, time to meet these regulations. 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and we had these discussions about it and talked with the adventure operators, how long would it take you, and that sort of thing. In New Zealand, as I recall, the government created regulations and then gave the adventure tourism industry 1 year to meet those regulations. 10 years in, the government looked around and saw that a lot of people had not met those regulations. They hadn't written their safety management systems. They didn't have a continuous improvement process in place. They didn't have a written emergency plan. They didn't have all the stuff. The government was faced with potentially shutting down the entire adventure tourism sector, or most of it, in the country. They didn't want that, so the government rushed to hire a bunch of consultants to work individually with adventure tourism operators in New Zealand, so in 2 months from now, they would be able to meet the standards when the regulations came in force. And to this day, there are some in New Zealand who are bitter about how the government failed to provide enough time and enough intellectual support or really money so that the sector could develop examples and templates and training materials and resources so that adventure tourism operators could understand how to meet the new standards. In Georgia, we ended up mostly saying 3 to 5 years. Georgia's not a high-income country like New Zealand. We wanted to give people plenty of time, but we felt like 10 years was a little bit too long. We wanted to move more quickly. And as I mentioned before, I think it's really important for government involvement to be robust throughout this process and to provide financial and other support to the private sector to help them build training schools and training schemes and written safety standards and so on, so that it's not a great burden to meet the safety standards. In Georgia, there's a adventure tourism school being built and expanded in Gudari high in the Caucasus Mountains, where there are training classes to help people become qualified adventure guides, and the government is in support of this. So this is one approach, and every nation, every territory is different, and so how regulations can be developed in any given country can really vary. So it's good to pay attention to the individual circumstances in any country and adapt what we've been talking about here to the particular conditions in any region that's considering this. And again, to have the government provide support in terms of money, consultants or guides to help adventure tourism operators understand how to meet the standards, that's really important. This is not for everybody. Adventure tourism regulation is not the right thing for every country all at once. It's important to think about, is this the right time? Is our industry ready for this? And is the government prepared to do this? Developing regulations is hard. You want adventure safety regulations to be rigorous enough to actually improve safety outcomes, right? But you don't want them so burdensome that people actually can't meet them and they go out of business and they do something else. There's a really fine balance in terms of regulatory development. It requires governments that have low levels of corruption and high levels of effectiveness and competence. And not every government at any given time is at the right place to do that. And it takes money and it takes time, and people want the benefits of regulation, but they don't like to be told what to do. And it's sort of an oxymoron. And so a lot of government agencies, they would rather not regulate the adventure sector because it's sort of a headache. You're going to get yelled at no matter what you do. And so this tends to work well when the government is effective and good at developing regulations and is able to develop a collaborative, cooperative relationship with the private sector so that both parties are coming together to develop common sense, effective regulations that are rigorous enough to make a difference, but not overly burdensome. When we think about kind of the big picture with adventure safety regulation, I think it can be useful to recognize that when the industry has safety standards that are thoughtfully developed in collaboration with specialists from the adventure tourism sector who really know the various activities, but also government authorities who understand what regulation is like and how to design regulatory regimes and which government agency is going to do the regulation and what are the civil or criminal penalties for nonconformance and what's the time frame to roll this out. When all this happens well, it elevates the entire adventure tourism sector in the territory or the country. When it doesn't happen well, it can be very difficult. In India, for example, after the girl died on a trek in the Himalayas, her family sued the government in the High Court in Mumbai and said, "We're not looking for money. This is a public interest lawsuit, but we are suing you to demand that you regulate the adventure tourism industry." And the government said, okay, we will create some regulations. They rolled out these regulations, and the adventure tourism sector in Maharashtra in Western India said, this is crazy. We cannot meet these things, no way. And the and the adventure sector sued the government and said, this is crazy. We can't do this, it's too much. And so the High Court in Mumbai said, okay, all right, government, you go back and you work with the adventure industry in Maharashtra and you come up with something that's effective but more reasonable. So a couple years go by, the government rolls out more regulations. The adventure sector sues again, says, nope, this is too much, impossible, too rigorous for us, we cannot do it. They went back and forth for 10 years. And in 2021, there was a government decree that said, okay, here are the regulations. And the adventure sector said, okay, after 10 years of back and forth, we don't love this, but it's okay, and we can live with it. And so finally, after more than 10 years of work, there are adventure tourism regulations in Maharashtra. Then a new political party came into force. And that new political party said, we don't really like what the old government did. We're going in a different direction. And so that 10 years of work was not as effective in the end as it could have been. And so this requires stability and competence and effectiveness in government agencies, and it requires government and private sector to have the maturity to collaborate and to talk and to compromise. And that is in place in many places, but it's not in place everywhere. I think that collaboration between government agencies and the private sector is really, really important. And as I said earlier, not every country is ready for this. It takes a private sector that can advocate responsibly and is open to sensible regulation, and it takes government agencies that have the skill to really understand the adventure sector and not create regulations that are either so weak as to be ineffective or so burdensome as to damage the industry. And so looking at whether you're a regulator or whether you're an adventure tourism operator, is this the right time to collaborate, to support safety standards that will elevate the entire industry? I think that's an important question for everyone to ask in areas that want high-quality adventure tourism and are considering a regulatory scheme as opposed to a voluntary scheme as an option. And you are not alone. There are many other countries that have gone through this. Oman, New Zealand, the UK back in the 1990s, Switzerland, many other countries have done this, and so there's an opportunity to collaborate with other countries. And New Zealand in particular has been a great resource and a role model for Oman, for Georgia, and for others. And when we're talking with government bodies about this, and we're working on things, we reach out to WorkSafe in New Zealand and encourage others to do that, to understand how things have worked there. If you are interested in more information about this, this was a lightning tour of a big topic, put together about a 3-page document that has links to various sets of adventure laws and adventure regulations, as well as articles and other information on regulatory regimes and how good regulation can improve the adventure tourism sector and elevate the reputation not just of an individual operator, but the attractiveness of an entire region or entire nation as a wonderful destination for adventure tourism. So you can click that, you can go to that link or look at the QR code and nerd out on all kinds of extra regulatory details if you'd like. So those are a few thoughts about the benefits and the mechanics of applying adventure safety regulation to advance the quality and the safety and the effectiveness and the reputation of the adventure tourism sector in any given jurisdiction. Thanks very much, and we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
You did mention that it can take several years. So in your experience with the destinations that you have worked with that were already ready to take that step. Thank you very much. So I just back up a little bit. Based on your experience with the destinations you've worked with that were already ready to take this step to work on their policies, how long did it take you to make it a law?
It really depends partly on political pressure. In Switzerland, the Sachsenbach Gorge tragedy was in 1999, and the government said, we don't want to regulate you. You do your own thing. And so the private sector came up with this voluntary scheme, and then more people kept dying, and the government kept getting pressure. And so it was more than 10 years before the government said, okay, we will create an act on high-risk adventure activities. In New Zealand, when Emily died, her father publicly pressured the Prime Minister of New Zealand and made a big fuss. And it was really him. It was really one person working really hard to push the government of New Zealand to create this. And he put a lot of resources into this, and the government moved fairly quickly to make that happen. Within 2 weeks of Emily dying, there was a group of school children hiking in Mangodapopo Gorge, and a flash flood came through there, and 6 people died there. So there was children and the school teacher drowned as well in the flash flood. So there was a real recognition that there was a serious problem that in the industry in New Zealand, particularly in rafting, the operators were seen as kind of cowboys and not really interested in safety. And so the government there moved quite quickly, too quickly, in the view of the adventure tourism operators. So it depends, I think, on the political circumstances. What our work in the nation of Georgia to develop regulations was supported by the international development sector, and is dependent on the political circumstances in Georgia. And Georgia has a complicated political situation, which has not accelerated its adventure tourism safety regulatory systems. Part of the development of the adventure tourism sector in Georgia was to establish a tourism law, and that was a requirement of joining the EU. And so the question of Georgia joining the EU is a very complicated political question. And so the development of adventure tourism regulation got entangled in those pan-European politics. And so it's unclear when things will be resolved there. Okay. So it can be very short, it can be 10 years or more, or it can be never, depending on the politics.
And in that case, a follow-up question. Do you accompany the destination through the whole process?
It depends on the situation. The support that we got came from an international development entity in the USA where I live, and that entity has experienced some political challenges in recent weeks. And so whether that work will continue is an open question, and if and when and how. We try to come in and give guidance and support, and then allow local people to have autonomy the less, if we can come in and provide advice and say, here's different models. For example, there was interest in developing safety regulations in Georgia for the zip line industry. And there are different safety schemes for zip lines. There's EN 15567, which is a European norm for zip line operations and installation and operations. There's the Association for Challenge Course Technology has a more strict guideline. South Africa has a guideline. So we looked at all these different models of, okay, what's the regulatory standard for zip lines that we want in Georgia? And we went with EN 15567 because it's the European norm, and Georgia was trying to move in that direction, and it was the easier norm. It was easier than some of these other stricter standards. So we came in and we said, based on our experience of looking at these standards around the world, this is the one that we regulate, and then so that got put in the report and the draft regulations, but then it was over to Parliament and the GNTA, the Georgia National Tourism Administration, to make the final decision, and we backed out.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Najib Khan. Is there any difference between, because if we talk about adventure tourism, there is a climbing, mountain climbing, trekking, and paragliding and river rafting. Is there any set standard for paragliding? Like recently, last August, one of my colleagues had a climber, paraglider. He took over from Hindu Kush, crossed the Himalayas, and then he was over Karakoram. And he fell down. He died, basically crashed. So the tour operator is still behind the bars because the consent were taken from paragliding, you're climbing over, basically you're flying over 7,000 meter peaks in between. But I'm here, it's very interesting. I would like to get back to you after this talk. And do you have any standards for paragliders?
Paragliding is usually regulated as a civil aviation administration sort of activity. And so it's a little bit different than mountaineering and whitewater rafting and those sorts of things. Industry bodies like the IFMGA have a really well-developed qualification scheme for mountaineering. The International Rafting Federation, IRF, is a little less developed, but they have some qualifications for whitewater rafting. But paragliding tends to fall under civil aviation regulations. And so if you're looking for standards there, you would look at civil aviation regulation. And you could look at civil aviation regulations in, say, New Zealand and use that as a model. But it's a little different because it gets into airspace and different types of landing zones and different types of zones, and you don't want conflict with airplanes and that sort of thing. So it's treated a little bit differently than other adventure activities, in my experience.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, we have just maybe time for one more question, if there is one. In the back there.
Thank you. My name is William. I'm from Kenya. Have you considered engaging the UNWTO as regards their standards for protection for the ICPT? Because if it can be enhanced through that system, maybe it can form a sort of generic a policy for the other countries to adopt. Just my thoughts.
We're affiliate members of the WTO, and I'm a big fan of what the World Tourism Organization is doing at the UN. I think they're a great venue for sharing good practice, but I don't have enough connections there to know exactly what their role and interest in engagement might be, but I think you have some good thoughts, and thank you for sharing them. We're just about out of time here, so again, thank you very much for your time and attention.